There's all this talk now about would gay people, if there were a cure for gayness, choose a cure for gayness, and who would choose that and who wouldn't choose that. And I would never choose it now. And if you had offered me that possibility when I was 13 years old, I would have jumped on it in an instant. So one's understanding of oneself and one's identity is perpetually in evolution, and that's been the evolution of mine.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter. This is a story about family. But not the mum and dad and 2 kids in the suburbs kind of family. That's one type of family still, but it's increasingly rare. And thankfully, our definition of what makes a family has changed radically over the past few decades to be much more inclusive. And today's conversation is proof of that in brilliant, vibrant colour. At the centre of this story is the great author and raconteur Andrew Solomon. Andrew grew up thinking he'd never have a family of his own because he was gay. And at the time when he was young, he wasn't seeing any rainbow families marching at Mardi Gras. There was a very different story being told about gay men back then. And as he turned from a boy into a young man, Andrew wrestled a lot with his sexuality. He even paid for sexual conversion therapy that promised to set him straight. It didn't. Along the way, Andrew became a very successful author and a giver of some of the most popular and most downloaded and watched TED Talks of all time. His book, The Noonday Demon, is one of the definitive books on depression. And Far From the Tree is a book about people who have children who live a very different experience to their parents, just like he did as a gay person. But more about that in the interview. The family Andrew lives with now has 6 parents and 4 children. It's complicated and beautiful, but life is complicated and beautiful. His beloved mother used to say to him that the love that you have for your children is a love like no other. And those words coloured the rest of his life, not only in good ways. So I started by asking Andrew how he felt when he'd hear his mother say those words.
When I was little, it made me feel very exalted. I thought being mother to my brother and to me had been the great experience of her life, and that was a great compliment. And then when I reached adolescence, it made me very anxious. I kept thinking, yes, but I think I'm gay, and if I'm gay, I presumably can't have children. And I'm troubled by the suggestion that I would be missing the most meaningful experience in life. And then when I got to be older than that and I came out, my mother kept saying it and it made me very angry. And I said, I'm gay. That's not the path that I'm on. You know that's not the path that I'm on. I want you to stop saying that. But she never did stop saying it. And while it drove me crazy at the time, I do credit it for having helped to propel me toward having children, which has in fact turned out to be an incredibly meaningful experience and unlike any other experience in the world, just as promised.
Why do you think when you came out to her that she said that?
There were several threads in the tension between my mother and me when I came out. At one level, she was worried that I would have a sad, lonely life, which was fairly typical for gay people in her generation. At another level, she was just embarrassed. She felt that she didn't want to be the mother of a gay son, and in order for her not to have that embarrassment, I had to stop being gay. And so there was a little piece of what I suppose was narcissism in the whole thing. And I think she genuinely felt that that the sort of intense sexuality of many long-term relationships fades over time. And the experience of having children is one that remains rewarding, for many people at least, over a very long period of time. And she sort of suggested that I was choosing short-term rather than long-term interests. What she didn't understand, I suppose, is that it wasn't that I was choosing a particular sort of erotic obsession that was minor and passing and then I would move on from it. It was a question of who I was and what my identity was and how I was to understand myself and how I was to be in the world.
Was there also, do you think, looking back now, a grief in thinking that she wouldn't have grandchildren?
Yes, I think there was a lot of grief about grandchildren. She said, you won't get to be a father and I won't get to be a grandmother. And she was she was distressed about that. I mean, I had a brother who seemed likely to have children, as indeed he did, but she couldn't imagine that I would, and she felt very cheated by that. And she felt her friends were all running around having children. She had been, for the time, a relatively older mother, and a lot of her friends already had grandchildren, and here I was obliterating that possibility.
When you were an adolescent, how did you feel about being gay, and what did you think that meant for your future? Did you think that you had to choose between a family and your gay identity?
Yes, I absolutely felt that I was going to have to make this terrible choice between being true to myself and having a family. And I wanted a family more than almost anything in the world. And I needed to be true to myself. And I felt completely ripped in two parts by it. And I dated women quite a lot. I went on dating, I dated some men, I dated some women. I went back and forth until I was well into my 30s. Not, I think, because I was really genuinely so bisexual. I mean, I guess I was a little bisexual, but if it had been the other way around, I wouldn't have been bothering with the less desired crowd. I was doing it because I thought, well, if I can make this work, then I could have kids. And I thought, but can I make it work? And then ultimately I thought, do I want to try to make this thing work in which I have to lie to the world and lie to myself? And even if people know that I've also been involved with men, I'm sort of committing not to ever be with one again. And it just felt too false and too wrong. And the idea of having children whose point of origin was a lie was a very terrible thought for me. But in my adolescence, I knew that my family was going to be very unaccepting, and I knew that the society at large was going to be very unaccepting. And, there's all this talk now about would gay people, if there were a cure for gayness, choose a cure for gayness, and who would choose that and who wouldn't choose that. And I would never choose it now. And if you had offered me that possibility when I was 13 years old, I would have jumped on it in an instant. So one's understanding of oneself and one's identity is perpetually in evolution, and that's been the evolution of mine.
Did people know that you were gay when you were at school?
People knew that I was different, and I don't know that they were able to use the word gay to describe it all the time. But I got taunted with that. I got called a faggot. And I think there's a world of difference between the experience of someone who is sort of captain of the basketball team, but also happens to like having sex with men, and someone who is extremely effeminate and marginalized. And I think I fell kind of squarely in the middle of all that. I mean, I was not particularly good at sports. I was not very athletic. I had a few things that I sort of liked to do okay. I was very interested in things that were in the arts. I was kind of interested in fashion and clothing. So, I was in this sort of nebulous place. And I mean, I would say that most of my friends were unsurprised when I finally did come out as gay. They hadn't necessarily completely known it, but it certainly wasn't unimaginable and inconceivable to them.
You tried pretty hard to be straight for a while. You even went to sexual conversion therapy. Can you talk a bit about what that involves? And I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny. It's an awful thing for some people who are forced to go there for religious reasons. But was it your idea to go?
It was my idea to go. And if you had told me at the time that I would be speaking about it on an international podcast, I would have been completely incredulous at the idea, because I felt like it was such a sort of shameful, weird thing to be doing. But I sort of thought, well, I seem to feel like I'm afraid of having sexual contact with women. And maybe if I go someplace where I get to kind of practice, I'll become less afraid of it. And in fact, that happened. I did become less afraid of it. And I did later on have sexual relationships with women. And I think having gone through that process was a good training for those subsequent experiences. But boy, oh boy, was it an exercise in self-hatred. I mean, it was really trying to make myself into someone other than who I was, because I thought that who I was unacceptable.
Did you have conversations with the women did you actually have to have sex with women? And did you talk to them and tell them how you felt? How did it work?
Well, there was this place that was the sexual surrogacy center that I had found an ad for in the back of a magazine. And I went there, and there were these women, and we had to do all kinds of bizarre exercises. I remember one where we had to crawl around naked on the ground, and I pretended to be a dog, and she pretended to be a cat, and we were sort of approaching one another tentatively. In retrospect, the fact that there was about two creatures who naturally dislike each other seems kind of loaded to me. But at the time, it was just sort of what was assigned. And I did eventually have sex with those women. But it was a sort of strange mix of the clinical and the kind of sordid. There were these people I was supposed to call doctors who oversaw these sessions with these women I was supposed to call surrogates. And I remember feeling embarrassed that I had to go there and, hoping no one would see me going in the little door that led to the staircase that went up 3 flights to get to this sort of strange, slightly grungy place. And my favorite detail from the whole thing is that I got to know some of the women, over a period of months. And there was one of them who finally admitted to me that she was really a necrophiliac and had taken this job after she got in trouble down at the morgue. So that was the world I was in.
You had a lot of bad things happen to you in 1991. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened in your life around that time? You were in your late 20s.
Yes, I was 27, and my mother died of ovarian cancer after a 2-year illness, and we had a lot of really intense interactions over those 2 years. And she had finally, before she died, said all of the right things about how she just wanted me to find love, and it didn't matter if it was a man or a woman, and all she wanted was for me to be happy. But I don't think she really meant them. And I think if she lived a few more years, she might have gotten to the point where she meant them. And so the loss of my mother was terrible. I had, at the end of 1990, ended my first kind of serious relationship with a man, my boyfriend Michael, whom I'd lived with for 2 years. It kind of fell apart because I was such an emotional wreck around the stuff with my mother. And also because I was probably immature and unready and still not comfortable being gay and all kinds of other things. But it all felt connected. So I'd ended the relationship with Michael. After Michael and I broke up, I had moved back to the United States so I could be with my mother while she was dying. I had been living in England. And then I couldn't decide whether I wanted to stay in New York or wanted to live in London or who I was or where I was supposed to be. And I felt like my friends in London were different from my friends in New York, and which were the ones, it just all felt like there were these terrible choices that had to be made. And it was the beginning, not the apotheosis, but the beginning of my developing a real depression. And also my relationship with my father was terribly strained. He felt that he was in grief and needed to be coddled and indulged. And I felt like I was also in grief and I was not interested in coddling and indulging him. And there was a lot of stress and tension and great sadness in my life at that time.
You felt that you got through it quite well, though. You said that you saw yourself, part of your identity was that you were the type of person that if you'd have been sent to a concentration camp, you would have been one of the survivors who would have been there when the camps were liberated. And so that was fine until 1994. What did you start noticing in 1994, a few years later?
Well, look, the discovery of one's own fragility is never a very pleasant experience. And I think I had been gradually decompensating starting well before my mother died. And then by 1994, I really began to settle into a serious depression. I was publishing my first novel, a book called A Stone Boat, that was loosely based on the circumstances of my mother's illness and death. And it also talked about being gay. And I felt like I was coming out all over again because I was coming out publicly as opposed to coming out to people I knew. I always feel very exposed when I publish a book. You sit there waiting to see if anyone likes what you've written and whether they say anything nice about it. And I don't know, it just all began to overwhelm me. I still hadn't really figured out what I wanted my life to be like. I wasn't in a good relationship. I just felt terribly, terribly alone and lost. And I began to develop a severe clinical depression. In the initial stages, what I noticed was just that I had developed a kind of lack of enthusiasm for many things that I had previously found delightful. But over time, I came to feel instead that that I was just overwhelmed by everything, and that the idea of going out and seeing people and interacting with them was more than I could possibly stand. And I found myself withdrawing more and more and doing less and less and feeling more and more overwhelmed, by ordinary, simple things. I would think I should take a shower. I would think, but okay, I have to get out of bed. I have to walk to the bathroom. I have to turn on the shower. I have to stand underneath it. I have to squeeze the shampoo bottle. Every single piece of it felt to me like an impossible challenge. And it also felt idiotic. I knew that most people take a shower every day and they don't give it much thought, and it takes them about 5 minutes and they're all set. And suddenly I just felt like I couldn't do it. It was too many steps. It was too many things. I couldn't face it. I couldn't bear it. And then some acute anxiety began to set in, and it was the feeling of being completely terrified all the time, as if I were sort of caught in that moment that one is in after you slip or trip before you hit the floor. And so bit by bit by bit, I really sort of went to pieces until finally one day I woke up and I felt so paralyzed that I thought I might have had a stroke. And I lay there thinking to myself, I should call someone. I need help. And I couldn't bring myself to reach for the phone, which was right next to my bed. And finally, my phone rang, and it was my father. And I said, something has gone very wrong. Can you come down here and help me?
You've written so beautifully in your book about depression and in your TED Talk, that the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. What's the difference between vitality and happiness?
Look, people tend to think when they get into conversations about depression that they all know what depression is, because we have this poverty in the English language in which we use the same word to describe how a child feels when it rains on his birthday and his party doesn't take place outside, and to describe how someone feels immediately before jumping off a bridge. And so people think, oh, well, I've been through times when I was depressed and when I was sad, and I just got through it by pulling up my socks and getting on with it. And I think the vitality story is the more significant one, because it's not that depression is sadness, though it often entails an enormous amount of sadness. It's that depression is really the loss of any kind of forceful life energy, the loss of any feeling of what you want to do or how you want to live or how you want to, that you don't have the wherewithal to do ordinary, simple, basic things. And you aren't interested in being alive. You may be in so much pain, in fact, that being alive seems unbearable. But even if you aren't in that kind of acute suicidal state, the pleasure is drained out of everything. It's not just that you feel sorrowful, you feel totally disengaged and disconnected. The fact that somebody loves you or that you've succeeded at something or that the sun is out, none of it registers on you at all. You have no sensors left for those kind of positive experiences.
You also have said that we often confuse grief, sadness, and depression. Is that what you mean? How is grief and depression different?
Well, I mean, the primary difference between grief and depression is the trajectory. If someone you love dies and then a month later you still feel sad, but you feel somewhat less sad, and a month after that you still feel sad, but a little better than you did the month before, it's probably grief and you're gradually emerging from it. And if you have a triggering incident, such as losing someone you love, and you feel really terrible, and then a month later you're functioning even less well than you were then, and then a month later you can barely function at all, and you're on a downward trajectory, then it's probably a depression that was instigated by grief. And while the grief is real and can't be and shouldn't be erased, the total paralysis and the inability to cope with the world is frequently pathological and does need to be addressed.
I was so moved by what you've written and talked about your father, how, your mother had died just a few years earlier. He obviously was dealing with his own grief, and you were a man who was almost 30 years old at that time, or maybe you were already 30, and you moved in with him. What happened after that? What was that next period like, and how long did it last for?
I had had a tense relationship with my father for the period when my mother was dying and the period right after she died. And then when I was depressed, I think my father felt that he had been unable to save my mother and that it was the great sadness of his life. And he had a terrible sense of dejection and failure about it. And I think he felt that he could save me and that he would do anything he could to do so. So my father was a businessman and had a sort of serious job. And the moment that I always remember was when I was supposed to be appearing in the San Francisco Book Fair. And I couldn't imagine. I could barely get dressed. I couldn't get on a plane. I couldn't do any of those things. And I said that I was going to have to cancel it because it was just beyond me to do it. And my father said, well, could you do it if I came with you? And I said, yes, Dad, but it's the day after tomorrow and, you have a job and everything. And he said, I can take some time off. And he said, I'm going to arrange everything and you're just going to have to get dressed and follow behind me. And we did. And I got to San Francisco and I actually appeared on the panel I was supposed to appear on. I was quite medicated when I got to the panel, but I did make it there and I did do it. And I think in depression, ordinary things seem incredibly steep. And at that early stage, at least of my career, the idea of being on a panel wasn't such a little thing. And I couldn't have done it without him. And he came to the panel, and I was originally supposed to be on a panel called First Novelists Tell How They Tell Their Tales. And I had been switched to a panel called Gay Novelists Tell How They Tell Their Tales. And it was San Francisco, and there were a lot of people wearing sort of bondage gear. And there was my father in his trench coat holding a briefcase at the back of the room. But he came through for me, and he just really took care of me in that period. When I was too overwhelmed to be able to cut up my own food, he cut up my food for me. And I sort of joked and said when he was an old man, I would cut up his food for him. And, we developed a new relationship through that period. So while the depression was horrible and I wish it had never happened, it certainly brought its benefits. And one of them was that renewed relationship with my father.
Medication was part of your treatment, therapy and medication. You've also written about wellness, and I want to quote you back to you and how when you're on medication, people sort of urge you to get off it. I'm on medication for anxiety, and I have no desire to ever get off it. But I know that a lot of people who have medication for depression and anxiety do feel that they should. And you've written, wellness is still in this area associated not with achieving control of your problem, but with discontinuation of medication. Can you talk about that a little bit and how you even had to battle that in your own mind?
Everyone who takes medication, at least initially, wants to get off of it. Everyone wants to think it's temporary, and almost everyone does go off it. And almost everyone then relapses, and many people then go back on medication. And you can go through that cycle multiple times, as indeed did I, until I finally accepted that I had a very serious condition that required medication, and I was going to have to stay on medication indefinitely in order to cope with it. I would rather not take the medication. It has some disagreeable side effects. It's very boring having to get out the pills every morning and evening. The whole process of it is an unattractive one to me in many ways and at many levels. But having said that, I feel like, the great question is whether does medication liberate you from the depression and allow you to be more fully yourself? Or does the medication take the real you who is depressed and turn you into someone else? And people struggle all the time with that question of authenticity. And my feeling is that we do an awful lot of things that are inauthentic. If we lived in a sort of pure natural state, we wouldn't use toothpaste and our teeth would fall out of our gums. And there's nobody militating against toothpaste. And I just feel like it is a mixture in some ways of a liberation and a recreation of the person who takes it, but it shouldn't be devalued for that reason. And also, and I always say this to people who are talking to me about their struggle over whether to take medication or not, life is short. And if you spend the year that you're 37 being terribly depressed, that year is gone and you will never be 37 again. And you've spent the whole year being depressed and unable to function well. And if there are things you can use that allow you to function well and allow you to have a good experience of being 37 and allow you to make progress in whatever the areas are in which you would like to make progress, or just allow you to have some afternoons when you feel happy and good about yourself, seize that possibility.
Apart from having more compassion generally, if there's someone in your life who has depression, and you're lucky enough to have not experienced it, how can we best help our friends, our parents, our children, our partners?
I always say that depression is a disease of loneliness, and that people who are depressed often find human interaction very stressful and try to push people away from them so that they don't have to interact with them. But if you really leave someone who's depressed alone, the depression will escalate and the person may very well become suicidal. And, if you can, go and talk to the person. And if they can't talk, sit by the bed. And if they can't stand your sitting by the bed, go sit on a chair in the hallway just outside. But don't go any further away than that. Don't ever leave someone who's depressed alone. And don't ever make someone feel like you're respecting their privacy by allowing them the distance that they may appear to be insisting on. That distance is itself toxic.
How did you recognize John as the love of your life?
Oh, that's a sweet question. So 19 years ago, I was on tour for my depression book, The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression, and I was doing various kinds of press interviews, and John came to interview me at the hotel where I was in Minneapolis when I was on book tour. I had not ever imagined myself spending a lot of time in Minneapolis. I had the typical East Coast notion that it was the middle of nowhere. But along came John, and I think we recognized it fairly immediately. It took us a while to figure out how to build a life together, and there were definitely some big ups and downs in our early years. But I just found him handsome and delightful and funny and warm, and he seemed to me like a really genuinely good person, and I admired the moral values he seemed to have. But as you know, when you're sort of falling for somebody, you don't really make up a list of their characteristics. It just sort of happens. And there we are, and it's been a long time now.
When did the prospect of becoming a father come up in your conversations?
Well, John was already the biological father of a child with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. And on one of our first sort of dates, John took me to the Minneapolis State Fair. And when we got there, we ran into this lesbian couple with their little baby, who was Oliver. And I thought, well, I really want to live in New York. And John is never going to move to New York because he's got this kid, and the kid is in Minneapolis. And what are we going to do about it? And I didn't really understand that John had specifically agreed to be just a donor, and that at that time he was not very much involved in the life of Oliver, mostly because they wanted it to be clear that the two women, Tammy and Laura, were Oliver's parents. So, but we therefore started talking about fatherhood early on, and I said it was something that I really wanted to do. And John said that he wasn't so sure that was something he wanted to do, but maybe he could, and talked about how much he loved kids. And it was a subject that we kept circling around and coming back to over and over again. And in the end, I mean, some years later, John really wanted to get married, which I wasn't that focused on, though now that I had a gay marriage, I'm a big advocate for it. And I really wanted to have kids. And we sort of agreed that I would have a big wedding with John, and he would accept the idea of our having children.
You had your first child with a female friend, not sort of with John, right?
Right. So my best friend from college had gone through a rather difficult divorce, and she lives in Texas, and I was down in Texas visiting her, and I said to her, "Do you regret getting divorced?" And she said, "No, I'm very relieved to be out of what was really a horrible marriage." She said, "But I'm really sorry about not being a mother." She said, "That was something I always wanted to do." And I said in quite a sort of jocund way, well, if you ever decided that you wanted to have a mother in an unusual way, I'd be glad to be the father of your child. But she was she's quite beautiful, and she was living in Texas, which is a relatively conservative place. And the idea that she would choose to have a child with a gay friend in New York seemed very obscure. But that conversation happened before I'd met John. And then on my 40th birthday, which was a couple of years after I met John, she came up to New York for my 40th birthday party. And she said, listen, if you really meant it, I think this would be a great idea. And I was kind of terrified of, embarking on the responsibilities of parenthood, but also incredibly excited by the idea and incredibly excited by the idea of doing it with Blaine, whom I had known since I was 17 and whom I knew I adored.
So she was actually pregnant at your wedding.
She was pregnant at our wedding. John said we had the first gay shotgun wedding.
And then she had a little girl also called Blaney, and you became a father in a different way than John was a father to the now two children that he'd been a donor dad, or donut dad as they called him, with the lesbian couple in Minneapolis. Is that right?
Yes, because John was quite uncomfortable with it initially. I said, but you've already had Oliver and Lucy. I said, it's sort of the same thing. And he said, it's not the same thing. You're planning to have a child who will have your last name, to whom you will be a father, and with whose life you're going to be deeply involved. He said, and we're just setting up our life together, and now there's this extra piece being added on that's yours and not mine. And it took a long time to figure it out, but ultimately we built a life together that I think was a really good life. He and Blaine are now best of friends, he and Mother Blaine. Little Blaine calls him Papa John. He became part of that life. It's true still that I'm more part of it than he is. I mean, I really am Blaine's dad, and I make a lot of decisions about her life, and I talk to her mother every couple of days, and he doesn't do all of that. But I think that we all constitute a family. And then John and I wanted to have our son George, and this I wrote about in my book, Far from the Tree. And when we were pursuing having George, we decided that I would be the biological father, and we found an egg donor through an agency. And then Laura, the lesbian mother of John's two biological children, offered to be our surrogate. So, and in the period of her being our surrogate, we got to be quite close to that family, and the children started calling us Daddy and Papa.
Oh, so now you have, talk me through it, like four children, so 3 states.
Yes, exactly. It's 6 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And so Tammy and Laura are there with Oliver and Lucy, and we aren't really their parents, but we play an important role in their lives. And Blaine is with Blaine and her now male partner, Richard, in Texas. And then John and George and I are here together in New York. And it sounds like this amazing, far-fetched political statement, but we didn't do it as a political statement. The little bits and pieces of it all seem to make sense, and they added up to something which we've since come to understand in its political terms.
You were writing Far from the Tree when, in the lead up to George being born. Can you explain the title of that book, Far from the Tree, and what it was about and why you chose to write it?
The book is about how families respond to children who are different from they are in some profound way. So it looks at families of children with deafness, dwarfism, Down syndrome, schizophrenia, autism, multiple severe disabilities. It looks at families of prodigies who are also quite overwhelmed. It looks at families bringing up children conceived in rape, at families of people who committed crimes, and families of people who are transgender. And the purpose of the book was really to explore the idea that while each of these conditions represents only a relatively small part of the population, the experience of having a child who's different from you and having to learn to come to acceptance of that child is effectively a universal experience. And it was all informed and framed by my experience as the gay child of straight parents. And it sort of ends with the experience of my becoming a parent. And my argument is that there are all these groups in which people have to learn their identity from their peers rather than from their parents because they have a defining characteristic that they don't share with their parents. But that can often be an experience that causes not only the child, but also the parent to grow immeasurably. And so I looked in talking to parents at what the process was through which people became grateful for lives they would have done almost anything to avoid.
Because you talk about the two different types of identity, there being vertical identity and horizontal identity.
I described vertical identity as being an identity that's passed down generationally from parent to child. So one's ethnicity, one's nationality, one's language, often one's religion. These are things that parents and children have in common. And some of them can be difficult. I mean, certainly in many Western countries, as there now exist, it is easier to be a white Christian than it is to be a Muslim of color. But nobody has suggested that the correct solution to that problem is to engage in genetic intervention that will cause the next generation of children born to Muslims of color to come out with blonde hair and blue eyes and have them baptized immediately. We recognize that the deficit is in the society and that what we need to do is change people's attitudes, not to change the people directly affected. And then there's what I call horizontal identity. Horizontal because it is an identity learned from a peer group rather than an identity that people already understand within their own families. It's a quality children have that is not in common with their parents, like the ones that I listed a moment ago. And in those instances, often children grow up with the sense that they're defective, and then at some point, they discover a culture that allows them to feel embraced. So most deaf children are born to hearing parents. Most dwarves are born to parents of average height. Most gay people are born to straight parents, and so on and so forth. And often the children at some point, usually around adolescence, discover a larger culture. And the deaf culture is an incredibly beautiful culture and a very compelling one. And once people discover it, they have a sense of identity that's come with that. And I call those horizontal identities.
There are so many extraordinary stories in that book, but I wanted you to just briefly tell the story of Clinton, who was born with a severe type of dwarfism, and a conversation that you had with his mother many years later.
Clint was born with diastrophic dwarfism, which is a very difficult condition. There are some dwarfing conditions that affect only height, and there are others that have many other effects. And children with diastrophic dwarfism they don't have any joints in their fingers, and they have, just endlessly, their bones are sort of curled around one another in a terribly troubling way. And I got to be close both to Clint and to his family. And I remember his mother telling me how when he was little, when he was born, the doctors at the hospital said to her, "Your child has this terribly deforming condition. He's not going to live very long anyway. He'll never reach the point at which he knows you or is able to have a conversation with you. Often in these instances, the child should just be left at the hospital to die quietly, and it might be easiest to do that if you never see him." And she actually thought about it for 3 days. And then she said, that's my baby, and I'm going to take my baby home and do my best. And if he never knows me and dies in a few months, at least I'll know I tried everything. And so she took him home, and she described how for the first year of his life, every time she took him to a doctor, the doctor would say, "Oh, can you imagine what's going to happen next? And do you understand how difficult is it?" They would go on and on at her. And then she finally got to the doctor who was the leading doctor in the United States for dwarfing conditions, for skeletal dysplasias. And Dr. Kopitz, she said, picked Clint up and held him up to the light and said, "Let me tell you, that's going to be a handsome young man one day." And in the course of his childhood, Clinton had 30 major surgical procedures, as a result of which he can walk, which many people with his condition cannot do. And he spent a lot of time immobilized in the hospital because a lot of them were spinal surgeries. And since he was stuck in the hospital and there was nothing else to do, he decided he might as well focus on his schoolwork. And it turned out he was incredibly good at his schoolwork. And he ended up becoming the first child in his family to go to university. And when he was there, he joined a fraternity, and he got a car that was specially fitted for his tiny frame, and began to drive. And his mother called me up one day, and she said, I was out doing some shopping today, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside a bar. She said, and I said to myself, he's 3 feet tall, they're 6 feet tall, 2 beers for them, it's 4 beers for him. She said, and I wanted to go in there and interfere, but I knew I couldn't do that. So I drove home and left him 13 messages on his voicemail. And she said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said to her, what do you think you did? What did you do that allowed this child with such a dire prognosis to emerge as someone who's happy and popular and successful and accomplished and engaged with the world? And she said, what did we do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were fortunate enough to be the first to see it there. And I'm pleased to say that was when I was working on the book that last year I went to Clinton's wedding, and it was a beautiful, joyful occasion. And his mother came over and put her hand on my arm, and she said, you know how I was never going to allow myself to imagine this day. And I said, yes, I do. And she said, but it's come anyway. And I said, it certainly has.
Oh, your most recent TED Talk was about this. It was about forging identity through trauma. And I listening to the story about Clint and thinking about your own mother and as parents, the fears that we have that our children's lives will be hard. And yet how, whether it's depression or other forms of identity, that helps the other forms of trauma, like being gay. And I mean, I know you were bullied at school. And how do you feel that that's forged your identity? And is that something that you've come to understand is a really powerful thing?
I really came to feel, as I worked on Far From the Tree and interviewed all of these parents and all of these extraordinary decisions that they'd had to make, and even in working on The Noonday Demon and interviewing all of these depressed people, that ironically, the people who try to run away from their problems are often the ones who are most haunted by them. And the people who say, I never wanted this isn't what I would have chosen. But having had these experiences, I found some kind of meaning or strength in them. Those were the people who were doing the best. The people who had depression and were able to say that were able to be prepared for the possibility that they would have another episode of depression. It's a cyclical illness, and most people have recurrent episodes. And they were able, when they had those experiences, to say, this is hell, but I know that I can learn from it. And I always remember one mother I met who had 2 children with very severe disabilities who both died in their teenage years, and who had been very devoted to them. And she said, people always give us these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. And I thought that was incredibly powerful, and I think it's absolutely true. I think there is a process of choosing to look into difficult experiences and find strength in them. And I've talked about the way that worked for everyone from Burmese peace activists through to the Greenlandic Inuit. I mean, all kinds of different people in different situations, people in American politics, people here, there, and everywhere. Every life is full of difficulty, and if you can spin some kind of meaning out of that difficulty, which you do through determination, not just because the meaning is sitting there waiting to be discovered, if you can do that, then you have a coherent narrative of your life that includes those dark times. And if you can't do it, then you see your life as constantly kind of dropping out of view or dropping out of focus in ways that are very troubling and very frightening.
Andrew, I could talk to you for so long. You're so sage. How did you become? How are you so sage?
Oh, thank you.
Do you just sit around thinking?
I do sit around thinking quite a lot, thinking I should be doing something other than sitting around and thinking.
I want to finish, even though I don't want to finish, with you telling the story of your 50th birthday party. And it's a story that when I heard you tell it, I think it was in a TED Talk, I immediately burst into tears. But it's not a sad story. It's about your son, who was 4 at the time, wanting to give a speech.
Yes, it was my 50th birthday. My husband and my father and my stepmother had all worked together to organize a party for my birthday. And I had, I think about 120 or 130 people there. And George, who was then 4, started pulling on John's sleeve, my husband's sleeve, and saying, can I make a speech? And John said, George, he said, you can't make a speech, you're 4. The only people making speeches tonight are Grandpa, Uncle David, and me. But George apparently kept pestering him, and John finally said, all right, I'll take you up to the microphone, he said, and you can try to call everyone's attention. You can say, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, he said, and then I'll make my speech. He said, I didn't want him to have a meltdown in the middle of the party. So they got up to the front of the room, and George said, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? And everyone kind of turned around, sort of startled. And George said, I'm glad it's Daddy's birthday. I'm glad we all get cake. And Daddy, if you were little, I'd be your friend. I still can't tell that story without tearing up. It's so remarkable to have your child say such a thing, and particularly to have them say such a thing in front of everyone you most love in the world. And we've had many wonderful moments and conversations since then, and he's now 10 and he's a great kid. But that particular moment, it was the best birthday present I've ever had.
And that was what your mum was talking about, right? It's a feeling like no other.
Exactly.
I could honestly listen to that voice all day. It is hypnotic. You should have seen my beaming face when I was talking to Andrew. I couldn't actually see him. We recorded this interview pre-COVID, and yet, because obviously he's in the States, we had to do it over the phone. So I couldn't see him. But now that you've heard his voice, reading his writing is even better than it was before, because you can hear his voice in your mind saying the words that you're reading. And the other thing I'd suggest you do immediately is to Google his TED Talks, because even though his voice can at times sound quite serious, he has this smile that just breaks open his face, and it fills up my heart in a way that is really hard to explain. I just love him. I love him. I kept telling him that after we finished the interview. I was like, I just want to say that I love you. And he was like, oh, you're very kind. And I was like, you've got such a beautiful smile. And he's like, I can't see you, but I bet you have a lovely smile too. The Noonday Demon is Andrew Solomon's book on depression, and Far from the Tree is his book on children who were born into families who are very different from them. They're both absolutely superb. We'll link to them in the show notes where you can buy them. And also, I just wanted to say you have been so lovely over these past few months. During lockdown, we have been working around the clock to bring you more episodes, and everyone here at No Filter and Mamma Mia have really appreciated your messages. I have a favour to ask though. You're very lovely to email me and message us and send Instagram comments, but could you go to the iTunes store and leave those messages or those kind words in a review? If you want to help do anything to say thank you, leave us a review. Give us a rating of whatever you think it is that we deserve, because that is how we can keep making this podcast. So I would just absolutely appreciate it. We have some amazing guests coming up in the next few weeks, including Elizabeth Gilbert. It's going to be, I think, the 3rd time she's been on the show. She needs no introduction, but she is the author of Eat, Pray, Love, Big Magic, City of Girls, and just international legend. And I haven't spoken to her, though, since the death of her partner, Raya Elias. And we had a chat about a week ago, early one Saturday morning, our time. And, I can't wait for you to hear her. She's coming up shortly on No Filter. Until I hear you next, or until I'm in your ears, friend, take care and lots of love.